My name is Daniel Alvarez, and for more than 20 years my boots have kicked up the dried dust of these wide plains. My hands have cracked under a sun that doesn't forgive, and my bones have chased the warmth of a blanket in winter nights where the wind slipped through every gap in the walls. I carry scars that time never managed to close, marks you can't see, but that burn deeper than any cut from a shovel or a plow. Today, as I look out over the fields from my family's farm, Highview, the land my grandparents defended with their bare hands and that now rests on my shoulders, I feel the need to pour out my story. I'm not doing this for pity or ego. I do it so the memories don't blow away like chaff, so I can understand what I'm made of and why. Despite all the storms, I'm still clinging to the same soil that once tried to bury me. I was born in a forgotten corner of a province no one visits unless they're lost, a place where time slows down in front of endless grain fields. The landscape is a sea of stalks that vanishes into the horizon, and the air always carries that unmistakable smell of dry grass and clay, especially when spring rain threatens but refuses to fall. For me, Highview wasn't just my grandparents' property, it was the whole universe. Within its fences I learned to read the furrows, to sense the exact moment to sow, and to understand that almost sacred murmur the earth gives off when it feels tended and respected. But my childhood wasn't just games between wheat rows or the echo of my grandfather's stories about harvests in other times. It was also built on heavy silences and absences that weighed more than steel. My mother, Elena, was the soul of our home. She had a soft voice and a smile that seemed to warm the kitchen air. As she cooked stew, she'd hum old songs that slipped out through the windows and mixed with the whistle of the wind. I can still see myself as a kid, sitting on a wooden stool beside her, listening as she spoke with passion about crop rotation, how to select the best seed for the next season, or how to treat the animals with respect like living beings and not just tools. "Listen carefully, Daniel," she used to say, brushing my hair away from my forehead. "The land has memory, and it has a soul. If you treat it with respect, it will return your sweat multiplied. But if you betray it, it will dry up like resentment." Those words, whispered in the half-light of our kitchen, became my first commandment. But happiness on these plains tends to be as brief as morning dew. When I was around 10, a harsh winter took my mother from us after an illness that devoured her in only a few weeks. The day she left, the sky turned a heavy gray, like the clouds themselves were in mourning. My father, Raphael, stayed by her bedside, holding her thin hand with a gaze that showed no tears, only emptiness. There was no sobbing, no scene, no consolation, just a man turned to stone. I, on the other hand, was shattered, clinging to my mother's body and begging for a miracle. With her last breath, Elena gave me a trembling smile, slid her hand through my hair, and whispered words that would mark me for life. "Take care of your grandparents, son. Don't let anyone steal this land from you. Promise me." That was her final will and my life sentence. After the funeral, my father became a stranger. The man who used to hoist me onto his shoulders to reach apples from the tree, who laughed loudly at family meals, died the same day my mother did. What remained was a bitter, distant shadow that wandered through the house with the sour smell of liquor on his breath and eyes blurred with a resentment I didn't understand. He started disappearing for days at a time, leaving me alone in a house that suddenly felt too big. When he came back, he barely looked at me. I wasn't his son anymore. I was just a living reminder of what he'd lost. One scorching midday, when I was about 11, he called me out to the yard. He looked at me with a mix of exhaustion and something like cold determination before dropping his sentence. "Daniel, pack your things. You're going to live at Highview with your grandparents. I don't have the strength to carry you anymore." There were no hugs, no promises to visit. I stood there, frozen, holding to my chest the old canvas backpack my mother had sewn for me, watching him walk away without turning back. I didn't cry in that moment. The shock was so deep that the pain needed days to find the door out. Arriving at Highview was like stumbling upon an oasis in the middle of a desert. The farmhouse stood on a gentle hill, protected by ancient oak trees that seemed to guard the passing of centuries. The stone house, with its thick walls to fight off the brutal winters and summers, greeted me with its porch draped in wildflowers and an old rocking chair that creaked every time the wind blew from the east. My grandfather Antonio, a man with leathered skin and calloused hands, wrapped me in a hug that smelled like earth and rolling tobacco. My grandmother Isabel, with her bright eyes and a voice that soothed you even when she scolded you, took my hand and led me inside, where the smell of fresh lemon cake filled every corner. "Don't cry, little one," she said firmly. "This is your inheritance, your home. No one is ever going to leave you alone here." The years that followed were the most formative of my life. Antonio became my teacher and my shadow. He taught me that being a farmer is not just a job, it's a way of seeing the world. At dawn, we'd head out to the fields so he could show me how to read the sky, to sense when the soil needed to rest, to know when the herd needed extra feed before the worst of the cold set in. He spoke of droughts so long that the wells seemed dead, of nights spent hand-watering each row, and of the shared joy of harvests when the whole village felt like one family. Through his stories, I understood that Highview wasn't just a piece of land. It was a legacy built with sweat and sacrifice that defined who we were. My grandmother Isabel taught me the other side, patience and resilience. Sitting at her feet while she crocheted in her old armchair, she told me stories about my mother's youth, how Elena worked the vegetable garden, and how deeply she loved every corner of these fields. "Your mother had the countryside in her blood, Daniel," she would say. "Now that same blood runs through your veins. It's your duty to keep it flowing." Those words gave me purpose, but they also placed a heavy weight on my shoulders. Not everything was idyllic. Many nights, lying under the wooden beams of my small room, I thought about my father. His visits were rare, brief, and full of tension. He'd come, ask a few obligatory questions, drink his coffee in silence, and leave before the cup was empty. One afternoon, driven by a mix of curiosity and pain, I couldn't hold it in and asked, "Dad, why don't you stay here? There's room for everyone." He sighed, avoided my eyes, and answered with a coldness that froze me from the inside out. "You'll understand when you're older, Daniel. The land doesn't just grow crops, it buries people." That thorn of abandonment lodged itself deep in my chest and grew with me. In spite of everything, Highview was my saving grace. I learned to ride horses, to patch fences crushed by winter storms, and to predict rain just by the change of color in the clouds over the distant hills. In summer, under the shade of the biggest oak, we drank the homemade lemonade my grandmother cooled in the well while we watched the sun die over the alfalfa fields. "All this will be yours, Daniel," my grandfather would say with solemnity. "But remember, the land only belongs to you if you can love it more than you love yourself." That passion became my engine. I started devouring books about agriculture, reading about new techniques I'd seen mentioned in rare farm shows on TV, and dreaming about turning Highview into a model farm where my grandparents' wisdom would meet 21st century technology. I had no idea then that my greatest battle wouldn't be against pests or dry spells, but against my own last name. By the time I was 15, I could feel a storm building on the horizon, a storm that would bring my father back into my life and force me to choose between family loyalty and the sacred promise I'd made to this land. But that was something time, relentless as always, would reveal later. For the moment, I hold on to the warmth of that home and the whisper of my mother's voice, which even now seems to guide my footsteps between the furrows. Those years as a teenager under my grandparents' roof forged in me a fierce love for the soil, a nearly mystical connection to the rhythm of the harvests, and a strange nostalgia for those peaceful days I knew deep down wouldn't last forever. During that time, my dreams evolved. I no longer wanted only to keep the farm from sinking. I wanted to transform it into something that could make the names of Antonio and Isabel echo with pride all over the region. I understood that honoring the past meant mastering the future, and that required the kind of patience you only get from watching grain grow slowly season after season. At around 16, my favorite refuge stopped being the fields and became a small office at the back of the house, a cramped room that smelled of old paper and ink. On its shelves, my grandparents kept their treasures, dusty agricultural manuals from decades ago, books on livestock, wine production, and a stack of farming magazines my grandfather collected like relics. I devoured them night after night under the shaking light of a cheap desk lamp, wrestling with concepts like soil moisture stress, nutrient cycles, or water retention capacity. I filled a notebook with ideas on how to improve fallow periods, what machinery could spare my grandfather's back, and how to plan crop rotations to get the most out of each patch of ground. Isabel, passing by with a glass of warm milk, would smile sadly and say, "You're just like Antonio when he was young, Daniel. Feet in the mud, head in the clouds." Her words fueled me, even as doubts attacked me every time I stepped back outside. Was I really capable of running Highview one day? We were talking about hundreds of acres of stubborn earth, a herd that never cared if you were tired, and a climate that could jump from frost to burning heat in just a few hours. I was just a kid who barely knew anything beyond our province. In those moments of weakness, Antonio would sit next to me on the porch, put his rough hand on my shoulder, and say, "The land doesn't ask you to know everything today, son. It only asks that you listen. If you love it, it will tell you itself when it's thirsty and when it's full." With that in mind, I threw myself into learning about modern farming. On our old TV, I saw a report about drip irrigation and controlled environment greenhouses. I was mesmerized. The possibility of fusing my family's ancient knowledge with cutting-edge technology became an obsession. I spent long afternoons in the town library and my few coins in the internet cafe looking up anything I could about soil sensors, remote crop mapping, and yield prediction tools. Each new discovery felt like a spark falling onto a pile of dry tinder inside me. My last year of high school was a blur of textbooks and cheap coffee. I wasn't the best student in literature, but in science and math, I was unstoppable because in every equation I saw a solution for the farm. My grandparents were my rear guard. Isabel went over my essays, often sighing that my mother would have corrected them better. Antonio made silent sacrifices. He'd sell a little more grain or one extra calf to fill an envelope he kept labeled for Daniel's studies. "You work hard," he'd tell me gravely. "We old folks will find the money somehow." The day the letter arrived from the National School of Agricultural Engineering in the capital, confirming my place in their program, I shouted so loudly half the village must have heard. I ran home and hugged my grandparents so hard I almost lifted them off the floor. My grandmother burst into tears of joy, and my grandfather just smiled, but I saw a single tear vanish into his wrinkles. "Go, Daniel," he whispered. "Go to the city and bring back the knowledge we never had a chance to get." Still, I was afraid. The capital, less than an hour from my quiet world, felt like a monster of asphalt and noise, and I was terrified of not being enough, or worse, that my absence would slowly kill Highview. The farewell at the bus station cut me open. My grandmother handed me a tin of homemade cookies, and my grandfather slipped a weathered notebook in my backpack, filled with 50 years of his notes on the local climate and the behavior of the land. "Don't forget where you come from," he said. "If you lose your roots, the wind will carry you away like straw." As the bus rolled toward the city, I cried uncontrollably, feeling the weight of 3 generations and the promise I'd made to my mother crushing my chest. The school in the capital was a brutal shock. I felt out of place among landowners' kids and city boys who had never touched a shovel. But I refused to be the clueless farm kid. I studied until my eyes burned, focusing on precision agriculture. I was fascinated by satellite monitoring, renewable energy systems for irrigation, and data-driven farming. Every time I learned to configure a sensor or design a system, I pictured Highview transformed into a reference point for the whole region. But the shadows kept following me. My father, Raphael, was a cold, distant echo. He'd call once or twice a year, voice thick and distracted, asking generic questions that showed he had no real interest in my life or in his parents' situation. The gap between us had become a canyon, but there was still a childish corner of my heart that wished he'd look at me just once with the same pride Antonio showed the day I left. Everything unraveled one gray afternoon in January. I was in a lab calculating water flows when my phone vibrated. My grandmother's voice was barely a thread. "Daniel, your grandfather. He had a heart attack. He didn't make it to the hospital." It felt like the world stopped turning. The man who had been my rock, my guide, my true father figure was gone. I collapsed on the lab floor, surrounded by cables and glassware, suffocating in my own sobs. I went back to the farm with my soul in pieces. The trip was a parade of memories. Antonio teaching me to milk, his rough laughter when I tripped over tools, his smell of sun and soil. The funeral was simple, but everyone from the village came. In a place like this, a man of his word is rare and deeply respected. In front of his coffin, in the small stone church, I swore his effort would not be wasted. A few days later, my grandmother asked me to sit with her in the living room. With trembling hands, she took a metal cash box from a cabinet and handed me an official document, the will. As I read, my heart pounded in my chest. Antonio had left everything to me. The farm, Highview, the herd, the equipment, the subsidy rights, every square meter of land passed into my name. He left my father only the minimum the law required, citing his abandonment and lack of care for the property. All the responsibility now sat on the shoulders of a 19-year-old. Why, Grandma? I whispered, my voice shaking. Why skip over my father? She looked me straight in the eyes. Because you're the one with the land in your heart, Daniel. Your father sold his soul to other demons a long time ago. Antonio knew that in your hands Highview would live on. In his, it would become nothing but money to be wasted. But the news of the will was the spark on a powder keg. My father showed up at the farm 3 days later. He slammed the door of his van as he got out, face twisted with rage, the smell of alcohol arriving before he did. "This is theft," he shouted, throwing a copy of the will onto the kitchen table. "How could that old man leave everything to some kid who barely grows a beard? I'm the rightful heir." Fear rooted me to the floor, but Isabel stood up with a dignity that stunned me. "You abandoned this house and your son, Raphael. Your father gave you 1,000 chances, and you threw them away. Highview is not up for debate," she declared. My father shot me a look stuffed with pure hate, resentment that had been aging in the dark for years. "You think you're so smart with your big city books, don't you, Danny boy?" he sneered, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You think you can keep what's mine by blood? I'll contest this paper until you're penniless. This land is mine, and I won't stop until you're begging in the streets." He stormed out, leaving behind a cloud of dust and a threat heavier than any storm cloud I'd ever seen over the fields. I stared at my hands, wondering if I was really strong enough to defend my grandparents' legacy from my own blood. After Antonio's funeral, life at Highview became an exercise in endurance. Grief hung in the air like dust during harvest, but there was no time for tears. The animals still needed feeding, and the fields didn't understand mourning. My father vanished for a couple of years, a pause I used to throw myself into my studies in the capital and into the farm every weekend. I spent weekdays in classrooms and labs, and every Friday I took the bus back to the farm, put on my work clothes, and broke my back side by side with my grandmother. I was exhausted all the time, but the promise I'd made to my grandfather and the fear of seeing the estate collapse kept me moving. The truce ended abruptly. 2 years later, the storm returned, this time with a new face. My father came back through the gate, but he wasn't alone. Walking beside him was a young woman named Clara, barely older than me, eyes sharp and ambitious, scanning the property like someone appraising loot. "Daniel, Clara and I got married at the courthouse," my father announced coldly. "Since we're legally married, we're moving into the main house. It's my right as son and husband." A knot formed in my throat. My grandmother, whose health had been fading, tried to protest, but my father cut her off, wielding his supposed right to reside and throwing legal terms at us about family property use. To avoid breaking my grandmother's heart completely, I made the worst mistake of my life. I lowered my head and let them in. Clara didn't even need a week to show who she really was. She had no respect for the rhythms of the land or for the stories that clung to those stone walls. For her, Highview wasn't a legacy, it was a poorly used real estate asset. She never stopped whispering in my father's ear, sharing plans that made my blood boil. "Rafa, this is such a waste of land," she would say. "If we get the zoning changed, we can split the Oak Grove into lots and build luxury houses. The town is growing and the city is right there." This place could be a gold mine. We could ditch this mud and live like royalty in a downtown apartment. I stood firm like a wall. As the sole owner on paper, thanks to the will, no sale or subdivision could be done without my consent and signature. That infuriated Clara, who started a campaign to break me down. She complained endlessly about the smell of manure, the tractors at dawn, and most of all about my presence. The tension exploded when she announced she was pregnant. Now that we're bringing a baby into the world, we need space and dignity, my father said one evening, unable to meet my eyes. Daniel, you're an engineer now. You've got your own life in the city. Clara says the baby needs your room for a playroom and his things. You have to move out of the house immediately. I was stunned. My own father was evicting me from the house where I was born, the house my grandfather had made me swear to protect. I looked at my grandmother. She was sinking into her armchair, tears tracing silent lines down her face, silenced by the fear of what my father might do. This is my home, Dad, I answered, trying to keep my voice steady. Grandpa named me heir, so I protect the land and care for Grandma. I'm not leaving. Clara jumped up as if someone had jabbed her with a pin, performing a textbook fake nervous breakdown. See, Rafa, your son is selfish. He hates us and your future child. I can't raise a baby under the same roof as this brute. My father, completely swallowed by her will, shouted, Get out of here. If you care so much about the farm, go sleep with the animals in the shed, but I don't want to see your face in this house again. And so, in one of the most humiliating moments of my life, I ended up moving into the old tool shed next to the stables. I cleared a corner between broken machinery and sacks of seed and turned it into my room. There was no proper heating, just a small gas heater that barely warmed the air, and the cold from the stone floor crawled up my bones on winter nights. But from there, in the dim light, I could keep an eye on my fields and, most importantly, slip into the main house to care for my grandmother whenever they went to town to waste what little money we had left. The months that followed were a waking nightmare. The baby, Leo, was born, and Clara used him as a shield for every new demand. She insisted the livestock had to go because the flies were dangerous for the child's health. She pushed my father to neglect the grain fields so she could later claim the farm was unprofitable and the only solution was to sell. My father, swallowed by alcohol and apathy, stopped working. He spent his days arguing with the few farmhands still loyal to my grandparents' memory, while unpaid bills started to pile up. The point of no return came when I got a call from an old classmate who worked at a notary office in the province's capital. He warned me that someone had tried to file a sale contract for the northern plot, the most valuable one, with direct access to water, using a signature that was supposed to be mine. They had tried to forge my name to chop up my grandfather's inheritance. That's when I understood that my patience had run out. If I stayed a passive spectator, Highview would die under concrete and greed. I contacted a lawyer from a small farmers association, an expert in rural law and inheritance. Daniel, legally you're standing on solid ground, he told me seriously. The will protects you. But they're inside the house, and there's a minor involved. This is going to be a long, expensive legal fight, and most of all, it's going to tear you apart inside. Are you sure? I clenched my fists, feeling the smell of the clay soil drifting in through the shed door. I thought of my mother's smile, of Antonio's rough hands, of Isabel's wounded dignity. I'm sure, I said, for my blood and for my land. I'm not going to let them destroy what 3 generations took almost a century to build. Let the battle begin. The atmosphere at Highview turned poisonous. We lived in a guerrilla war where hate replaced respect. Cornered by their own greed, my father and Clara dropped all pretenses. They tried to break me by attacking my refuge in the shed. They cut the power line that came from the house, sabotaged the fuel tanks for the tractors, and blocked the access tracks with broken machinery to stop me reaching the fields. But they miscalculated badly. They kept seeing me as the helpless boy my father had pushed away with a canvas backpack. They didn't understand that in front of them now stood an agricultural engineer backed by the law, with the land's legitimacy in his veins and will tempered by frost and fire. I filed eviction and property protection lawsuits in the provincial court. I presented everything: the handwritten will, evidence of mismanagement, reports on the attempted sale with a forged signature. The legal battle was a torment. I watched Clara deliver the performance of her life, crying crocodile tears in front of the judge and claiming I was a monster trying to throw a baby onto the street. I listened to my father call me an ungrateful son, accusing me of betraying our blood. But facts are stubborn and documents don't cry. Expert reports prove the systematic neglect of the farm, the missed payments on insurance and contributions, and, most damning of all, the handwriting analysis that showed the clumsy attempt to fake my signature on the sale contract. The judge ruled in my favor. Eviction was ordered, and they were given a non-negotiable deadline of 60 days to leave the house. The day they drove out through the gate for the last time, the air felt lighter, even if the taste in my mouth was bittersweet. I watched from a distance as my father loaded their few belongings into the van, eyes glued to the ground, shoulders bent under the weight of a defeat he had brought on himself. Clara, true to form, spent the whole time shouting insults and curses at the stone walls, as if the house itself were to blame for her failure. I didn't feel the triumph I'd imagined, only a sharp stab of pity for the man who had once been my hero and had turned into a stranger. When the van disappeared over the rise, it felt like Highview itself exhaled in relief. You could almost hear it in the rustle of the oaks. Sadly, victory came with an irreplaceable emptiness. My grandmother Isabel didn't live to see justice. She died a few weeks before the ruling, in a modest room we'd set up for her in the stable wing as her final little fortress of dignity. She left quietly, squeezing my hand with her thin fingers while the wind rattled the roof beams. "Make these fields sing again, Daniel," she whispered. "Do it for your grandfather, for your mother, and for yourself." Then her light went out. With full control of the farm in my hands, I started rebuilding. I poured every cent of the savings my grandparents had protected and secured a loan aimed at young farmers. It was time to move from plans on paper to real changes. I installed the drip systems with remote monitoring I designed in school, raised high-tech greenhouses with climate control, and rebuilt the herd, this time aiming for the highest standards, certified sustainable livestock for demanding markets in the capital. The following years were pure work and sacrifice. I labored from sunrise to long after sunset, season after season, forgetting about weekends and holidays. Every drop of sweat on the clay, every sleepless night studying yield maps and nutrient levels was another brick in the promise I'd made over my grandfather's coffin. Highview stopped being a crumbling inheritance and became a model farm, a place people visited to see how tradition and innovation could coexist without tearing each other apart. One evening this last autumn, with the setting sun bathing the grain fields in a deep golden light, I stopped in the middle of the property. I took in the healthy crops, the mirrored glass of the greenhouses, and the rhythmic whisper of sprinklers mixing with the lowing of cattle in the valley. I closed my eyes, and, for the first time in more than 20 years, I felt complete peace. The breeze carried that smell of red soil and wild herbs, and for a second I could feel the presence of Elena, Antonio, and Isabel beside me, like their shadows were walking at my side, smiling at what we had achieved together. Not long ago, I heard that my father lives in a small rented apartment in the city, swallowed by loneliness after Clara left him the moment she squeezed the last coin out of him. I don't know if time will ever make me generous enough to forgive him, but I've decided that his shadow won't cover my path anymore. I stayed there, alone in front of the horizon, and murmured into the wind, "We did it, Grandpa. The land is still ours." As the sun disappeared behind the distant hills, I understood that whatever happens from now on, this is my place, my refuge, my home, my eternal legacy. Thank you for staying with me until the end of my story. If it resonated with you, hit like, tell me in the comments what part touched you the most, and where in the world you're listening from, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel because there are many more stories like this on the way.